December 20th, 1941. The sun hung low over the mountains of southern China, casting long shadows across the dirt runway at Kunming. 24 American pilots climbed into their planes. The mechanics who serviced those planes had a nickname for them. They called them flying coffins. The Japanese were coming. 10 heavy bombers, at least 15 Zero fighters, the deadliest aircraft in the world. Light, fast, agile beyond belief, they could turn on a dime and climb like rockets. In the hands of experienced pilots, they were unstoppable. The Americans knew this. They had been losing for 3 weeks straight. 11 pilots dead, 15 planes destroyed. Every time they went up, they came back with fewer men. The survivors sat in the alert shack smoking cigarettes, writing letters home they prayed would never be mailed. Their planes were P-40 Warhawks, heavy brutes wrapped in steel armor, 7,000 pounds fully loaded. The experts said they were obsolete. The British said they were garbage. The pilots themselves weren't sure anymore. But by 3 o'clock that afternoon, something impossible would happen. The sky would be filled with smoke. Japanese planes would be falling from the sky like broken toys. Zeros would be burning in rice paddies. Bombers would be scattered across the jungle in pieces. And those 24 Americans, not one, would have a scratch. 13 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 0 American losses. The impossible ratio, 13 to nothing. How did they do it? The answer is a tactic so shameful that pilots nearly mutinied when ordered to use it. A tactic that would save thousands of American lives. A tactic that would change aerial warfare forever. But to understand that victory, you have to understand the nightmare that came before it. 13 days earlier, November 15th, 1941, same mountains, same dirt runway, different outcome. Jack Newkirk sat in his cockpit 22,000 feet above the green ridges of Yunnan province. He was 28 years old, former Navy pilot, best in his flight school class, dark hair, strong jaw, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a recruiting poster. Behind him in trail formation flew 3 other P-40s. The number 4 plane was flown by a kid named Jim Parker. 24 years old, first combat mission, his hands were sweating inside his leather gloves. Ahead, just visible through the haze, 6 Japanese aircraft. Bombers, fat twin-engine birds cruising at 15,000 feet, and weaving above them, glinting silver in the sun, the escort. 4 Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters. Newkirk keyed his radio, his voice crackled through the static. Contact, 6 bandits, 2 o'clock high, we're going in. This was what he had trained for, what every fighter pilot since 1916 had trained for. The merge, the fight, the test of skill and courage in 3 dimensions. He pulled the stick. The heavy P-40 groaned as it banked left. He was going to turn into the enemy formation. Get behind them, line up his guns. This was how you fought. This was how Knights of the Air had always fought. It was textbook. It was honorable. It was exactly what the instructors back in Pensacola had drilled into him. It was a death sentence. The P-40 turned like a dump truck trying to drift. The controls were heavy. The plane wanted to fly straight. It fought him. The turn was wild and sluggish, bleeding airspeed with every degree of bank. Newkirk glanced back. The Zeros had seen them, and they were reacting. But they weren't running. They were turning toward the Americans, eager, almost playful. What happened next took 15 seconds. The lead Zero rolled inverted and pulled, not yanked, not forced. The pilot simply thought about turning, and the plane obeyed. It cut across the sky like a dancer. Light, graceful, deadly. Newkirk was still trying to tighten his turn when the Zero appeared in his mirror, already inside his radius, already lining up. He swore, pulled harder. The P-40 shuddered. The wings lost lift. The plane was on the edge of a stall. The Zero's guns flashed. 20-millimeter cannon shells. Not the light rifle caliber bullets American planes used. Real cannons, the kind that could take a wing off. The shells cracked past Newkirk's canopy. Bright tracers. He felt the impact somewhere behind him. Metallic thuds. But the armor held. The thick steel bathtub around his seat did its job. He was alive. For now. But his wingman wasn't. Bobby Chen, 22 years old, American pilot, Chinese heritage, flew the number 2 position. He had made the same turn Newkirk made, tried the same maneuver. The Zero behind him didn't miss. The 20-millimeter shell punched through the thin aluminum behind Chen's seat. There was no armor there. The designers had saved weight. The shell continued through Chen's back, through his chest, and exited through the instrument panel. Chen's plane rolled left, slowly, almost gently. Then the nose dropped. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The plane entered a spin. Jim Parker, flying number 4, watched it happen. His first combat mission. He saw Chen's plane corkscrewing down, saw the smoke, saw the flames start to lick along the fuselage. He waited for the parachute. Chen should bail out. He had time. But the canopy never opened. Chen was already dead. Parker keyed his radio. His voice was high, panicked. Lead 2 is hit, 2 is going down. Newkirk saw it, saw the smoke trail, saw the plane tumbling through 12,000 feet, 11,000, 10,000. There was nothing he could do. The Zeros were all over them. If he tried to help, he'd die too. "Break off!" Newkirk shouted into the radio. "Everybody break! Run for the deck!" They dove. Not the controlled tactical dive they would learn later. This was panic. This was survival. 4 P-40s scattered like startled birds, each pilot pushing the nose down, trading altitude for speed, trying to get away. The Zeros didn't chase. They didn't need to. They had already won. They formed back up over the bombers, resuming their patrol pattern. Bored, unconcerned. Chen's plane hit the jungle at 300 miles per hour. The impact scattered debris across half a mile. There would be nothing to recover, nothing to send home. Newkirk landed at Kunming 40 minutes later. His hands were shaking. Adrenaline dump. The mechanics ran out to his plane, expecting the worst. They walked around the P-40 slowly, counting. 47 bullet holes. 47 places where Japanese machine gun rounds had punched through the aluminum skin. The wings looked like Swiss cheese. The tail had a jagged tear 3 feet long. But Newkirk was alive. The armor had saved him. The bulletproof windshield had 2 impact craters but hadn't shattered. The steel plate behind his seat had 7 dents where bullets had flattened against it. He climbed out of the cockpit. His legs nearly gave out. He sat on the wing head in his hands. Mike Sullivan, his best friend, landed next. His plane had 32 holes. Then Parker, 21 holes. The kid was white as a sheet, couldn't stop shaking. The number 2 plane never came home. That night, Newkirk sat in the barracks writing a letter to Bobby Chen's parents, trying to explain how their son had died, trying to make it sound honorable, trying to lie. He stared at the paper. The pen wouldn't move. How do you tell someone their son burned alive because he followed orders, because he did what he was trained to do, because he tried to turn with an enemy he could never outturn? Newkirk crumpled the paper, started again, crumpled that one too. Across the compound, in a small office lit by a single lamp, a man sat studying reports. Claire Chennault, 48 years old, leathery face, partially deaf in his right ear from a training accident years ago. He wore civilian clothes because he wasn't officially in the military anymore. They had kicked him out. He read the after-action reports, read the casualty list. Another name added to the growing list of dead. This was the 3rd pilot killed that week, the 11th in 3 weeks. Chennault knew why they were dying. He had known for 4 years, had tried to tell anyone who would listen, but nobody wanted to hear it. He picked up a pencil, started making calculations on a notepad. Wing loading, power to weight ratios, energy states, physics, hold hard physics. The P-40 couldn't outturn a Zero. That was a fact. Like gravity, like the speed of light. You couldn't change it with courage. You couldn't overcome it with determination. But the P-40 could do something the Zero couldn't, something the Japanese designers had sacrificed to achieve that beautiful agility. Chennault had figured it out. Now he just had to convince the pilots, had to convince them to abandon everything they thought they knew about air combat, had to convince them to do something that felt like cowardice. The losses continued. November 18th, 2 more P-40Ss lost in a fight near the border. 1 pilot killed, 1 bailed out with a shattered leg. November 22nd, another dogfight, another attempt to turn with the Zeros. 3 P-40S shot down, 2 pilots killed, 1 captured. November 25th, the worst day yet. 8 P-40s intercepted a Japanese formation, tried to engage in a turning fight. 4 planes lost, 3 pilots dead, one so badly burned he died in the hospital 2 days later. The math was brutal. Kill ratio 4 American planes for every Japanese plane destroyed. And most of the time, the Americans didn't destroy any Japanese planes. They just died. The mood at Kunming was toxic. The pilots sat in the alert shack smoking, drinking, not talking. They stared at their planes with a mixture of hatred and fear. They called the P-40 a lid sled, a flying brick, a coffin with wings. Every time the alarm sounded, every time they had to scramble, they wondered if this would be the mission they didn't come back from. Tommy Bradford, a 30-year-old veteran with 12 kills from the Great War, sat with his injured leg propped up. 3 days earlier, he had tried to outturn a Zero at low altitude. The P-40 had stalled. He'd crashed, broken his leg in 2 places. Lucky to be alive. He stared at the younger pilots, saw the fear in their eyes. "This plane is garbage," he said. His voice was bitter. "We need Spitfires. We need something that can actually fight." Mike Sullivan, Newkirk's wingman, looked up from the letter he was writing. A letter to his wife. She was pregnant. He hadn't told many people. "It's not the plane," Sullivan said quietly. Bradford glared at him. "What did you say?" "I said it's not the plane, it's how we're flying it." "You calling me a coward?" "I'm saying maybe we're doing it wrong." Bradford stood up. Even with the crutches, he was intimidating. "I've been flying fighters since before you were born, kid. Don't tell me about wrong." Newkirk stepped between them. "Knock it off, both of you." But the seed was planted. In Sullivan's mind, in a few others. Maybe it wasn't the plane, maybe it was something else. December 7th, 1941. A date that would live in infamy. Pearl Harbor. The news reached Kunming 2 days later, delayed by distance and broken communication lines. When it finally arrived, the pilots gathered around the radio in stunned silence. The Japanese had attacked Hawaii, sunk battleships, destroyed aircraft on the ground, killed thousands. America was at war. Officially, completely. And these men volunteers who had come to China for adventure and a paycheck were now the tip of the spear. The only Americans fighting the Japanese in the air. The pressure was immense. That same day, Chennault called a meeting. Every available pilot, 68 men, filed into the briefing room. Cigarette smoke thick in the air. 12 seats were empty. Ghosts. Men who would never sit in those chairs again. Chennault walked to the front of the room. He looked older than 48. The sun and stress had carved deep lines into his face. His eyes were hard, tired. He didn't say anything at first, just picked up a piece of chalk and started drawing on the blackboard. A simple diagram, a P-40 high in the sky, an arrow pointing down, a 0 below, another arrow pointing back up. The pilots watched, confused, waiting. Then Chennault turned around. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried. Every man in that room heard him clearly. "From this moment forward," Chennault said, "turning with a 0 is forbidden." The room erupted, chairs scraped, voices rose. Bradford stood up, leaning on his crutches. "You're telling us to run away." Chennault looked at him. No anger, just cold fact. "I'm telling you to survive. Knights of the Sky don't run. Knights of the Sky are buried all over France," Chennault said. "I'm trying to make sure you're not buried in China." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Newkirk stared at the diagram on the board, at the simple arrows. Up, down, up again. No circles, no turns. It felt wrong, against every instinct, against everything he had been taught. But he thought about Bobby Chen, about the empty seats, about the mechanics writing letters home. He thought about the 47 bullet holes in his plane, about how close he had come. Maybe Chennault was right. Maybe honor was a luxury they couldn't afford. If you served in World War II, or if your father, did you know what it meant to trust your training, to trust your officers, to believe that the way you were taught was the right way, the only way? Now imagine being told that everything you learned was wrong, that the tactics that won the last war would kill you in this one. That's what these men faced. And most of them couldn't accept it. But a few could, a few were willing to try, and those few would change history. Chennault continued his briefing. He explained the physics, spoke in terms anyone could understand. "The 0 is light," he said. 2,400 kilograms. Big wings. When it turns, the air grabs those wings and whips it around. Beautiful. Deadly. But that lightness comes with a pay. He drew another diagram. A zero in a dive. Lines radiating from the wings. When a zero dives past 350 miles per hour, the wings start to shake. The controls lock up. The pilot loses authority. The plane is built for low-speed maneuvering, not high-speed flight. Push it too hard and it breaks apart. He turned back to the pilots. The P-40 is the opposite. 3,400 kilograms. Small wings, thick armor. It hates turning, but it loves speed. Point this plane at the ground and it will hit 500 miles per hour without complaint. And when you pull out of that deep, and all that speed converts to altitude. Physics, simple physics. Bradford scoffed. So we're supposed to just dive past them and run away? No, Chennault said. You dive, you shoot, you zoom back up, and you do it again and again until they're all dead or running. He walked closer to the seated pilots, looked them in the eyes. This isn't about honor. This isn't about being brave. This is about killing the enemy and coming home alive. If you can't accept that, leave now. Nobody moved, but nobody looked convinced either. Chennault sighed. He had expected this, had prepared for it. Tomorrow morning, he said, 6 a.m., practical demonstration. I'll fly. Anyone who wants to learn, come watch. The room stirred. Chennault hadn't flown in 4 years. He was nearly 50, partially deaf, a civilian advisor, not a combat pilot. You're going to fly, Bradford asked, skeptical, almost mocking. I'm going to show you how to win, Chennault said. He left the room. The pilots sat in stunned silence. Newkirk looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked back. You believe him? Sullivan asked. Newkirk thought about it, about Chen burning, about the fear he felt every time he took off, about the fact that doing what he was trained to do kept getting people killed. I don't know, Newkirk said, but I want to find out. That night, Newkirk couldn't sleep. He walked out to the flight line. His P-40 sat in its revetment, dark and silent. The shark mouth painted on the nose looked almost sad in the moonlight. He climbed up on the wing, ran his hand over the armor plating, felt the dents where bullets had hit, where the steel had done its job. This plane had saved his life. Maybe it could do more than just survive. Maybe it could win. He thought about his father, a veteran of the Great War, a man who believed in honor above all else, who had raised Newkirk on stories of the Red Baron, of dogfights and duels in the sky. What would his father say if he knew his son was being told not to fight, to dive and run? But then Newkirk thought about something else. He thought about going home, about seeing his family again, about growing old. Honor was important, but life was more important. He made a decision. Tomorrow he would watch, he would learn, and if Chennault was right, he would follow. Even if it meant being called a coward, even if it meant letting go of everything he thought he knew. Because at the end of the day, dead heroes don't win wars. Living soldiers do. December 8th, 1941. Dawn broke cold over Kunming. The air smelled of aviation fuel and dew on the grass runway. 6 o'clock in the morning. 20 pilots stood on the tarmac, breath fogging in the chill, watching an old man climb into a cockpit he hadn't sat in for 4 years. Claire Chennault settled into the P-40. His movements were stiff, joints that had aged without the constant training of younger men. But his hands moved over the controls with muscle memory. Throttle, mixture, magnetos. The same dance pilots had done since the first aircraft took flight. The engine coughed, caught. The propeller spun into an invisible disc. The Allison Phi 12 roared to life, 1,200 horsepower shaking the airframe. Jack Newkirk stood at the edge of the runway, arms crossed, watching, skeptical but curious. Beside him, Mike Sullivan shifted his weight from foot to foot. Nervous energy. Tommy Bradford stood apart from the group, leaning on his crutches. The cast on his leg was fresh, white plaster already stained with dirt. He watched Chennault with undisguised contempt. This is going to be a disaster, Bradford muttered to the pilot next to him. Old man's going to stall it on takeoff. But Chennault didn't stall. He advanced the throttle smoothly. The P-40 rolled forward, picked up speed. The tail lifted. At 70 miles per hour, the main gear left the ground. The heavy fighter climbed away from the field, banking west toward the training area. 4 other P-40s followed, young pilots who had volunteered to be targets, to play the role of Zeros. They climbed behind Chennault, forming up in a loose combat spread. The radio crackled to life. Chennault's voice, calm, almost bored. Beginning demonstration. Observe. On the ground, the pilots watched. Some had binoculars. Others just shaded their eyes against the rising sun. At 10,000 feet, Chennault leveled off. The 4 opposing planes climbed higher. 15,000 feet, simulating the altitude advantage a zero formation might have. Then they dove on him. This was the scenario every American pilot had faced. Zeros above, diving down. The natural response was to turn into them. Meet the threat. Fight. Chennault didn't turn. He pushed the nose down. Not a gentle descent, a defied. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The P-40 fell away from the attacking aircraft like a stone dropped from a bridge. The airspeed indicator spun. 200 miles per hour. 250, 300, 350. The plane didn't shake, didn't shudder, just fell. Clean, fast, solid. The 4 pursuers tried to follow. They pushed their noses down, tried to match the dive angle, but they were young, inexperienced. They pulled too much power, dove too steep. Their planes buffeted in the high-speed turbulence. At 5,000 feet, Chennault's plane was doing 400 miles per hour, a speed the instructors had told them would tear the wings off. But the wings stayed on. The P-40 was built for this. American engineering, thick spars, heavy rivets, overbuilt and proud of it. Then Chennault pulled, not a sharp yank, a smooth progressive pull, back pressure on the stick. The plane responded, the nose came up, the wings bit into the air, G-forces built. 3 Gs, 4 Gs, 5 Gs. On the ground, the pilots could see it, see the P-40 scoop out of the dive, see it transition from falling to climbing, speed converting to altitude, kinetic energy becoming potential energy, physics in motion. The plane rocketed upward, 8,000 feet, 10,000, 12,000. In 30 seconds, Chennault had dove 2 miles and climbed back to his starting altitude. The 4 pursuers were still at 8,000 feet, struggling to catch up, already beaten. Chennault's voice came over the radio again, still calm, teaching. Speed is life, altitude is life insurance, turning is death. Questions? There were no questions, just stunned silence. Newkirk lowered his binoculars. He had watched the whole thing, seen the impossible become real. An old man in an outdated plane had just made 4 younger pilots look like student pilots on their first solo. "I'll be damned," Sullivan whispered. Bradford said nothing, just turned and limped away. The briefing room that afternoon was packed. Every pilot who could walk was there. Word had spread, the old man could still fly, and what he had shown them that morning had shaken something loose. Chennault stood at the front. No chalk this time, just words. "You've been taught that air combat is about turning," he said, "about getting on the enemy's tail and staying there. That worked in 1918. Wood and canvas biplanes at 120 miles per hour. The physics were different then." He paused, let that sink in. "In 1918, my brother flew a SPAD 13 in France. David Chennault, 22 years old, good pilot, 3 confirmed kills. He followed his training. Did everything the instructors at Issoudun taught him." This was new information. The pilots leaned forward. Chennault never talked about his family, never talked about anything personal. One day David got into a fight with a Fokker D7. The German pilot was better, started to outturn him. David did what they taught him, pulled harder, tried to get inside the German's circle, tighten the turn, win the advantage. Chennault's voice didn't change. Still flat, emotionless, but something in his eyes went cold. At 800 feet, the SPAD stalled, spun in. My brother never recovered. He crashed into a field outside Verdun. They buried what was left of him in France. I was stateside, training the next batch of pilots, teaching them the same tactics that killed him. The room was silent. Men shifted uncomfortably. I swore at his funeral that I would never teach tactics that got pilots killed. I spent 10 years studying, calculating, testing. I proved that energy tactics, altitude management, and speed control would dominate the next war. And you know what happened when I presented my findings to the Army Air Corps? He looked directly at Bradford. They called me a coward, said I was teaching men to run away, forced me into retirement. Bradford met his gaze, didn't look away, but something in his expression softened. Now the war is here, Chennault continued, and I'm watching it happen again. Good men dying because they're doing what some instructor told them was honorable. Well, honor doesn't matter when you're in a smoking hole in the ground. He walked to the window, looked out at the flight line, at the P-40S sitting in their revetments. Tomorrow we start training, real training. I will teach you how to dive without blacking out, how to zoom without stalling, how to kill zeros without ever turning. And if you cannot accept this, if you cannot let go of the old ways, then get out of my unit, because I will not send you up to die for pride. He turned back to face them. Class starts at 0600, dismissed. The pilots filed out, some excited, some thoughtful, some angry. Newkirk hung back, waited until the room was empty except for Chennault. Sir, Newkirk said, I want to learn. Chennault studied him, saw something in the younger man's eyes, the willingness to change, to adapt. Good enough, Chennault said. Bring your wingman, you'll be the first flight. For the next 5 days they trained, not the whole squadron, just the volunteers, the ones willing to try. 16 men, 4 flights of 4 aircraft each. The drill was simple, brutal, repetitive. Climb to 20,000 feet, wait for the signal, roll inverted, pull into a dive, accelerate to 400 miles per hour, pick a target on the ground, a white cloth laid out on the dirt, dive until the target fills the windscreen, then pull, smooth and progressive. Feel the G-forces crush you into the seat. Fight the gray out. Keep pressure on the stick. Feel the plane transition from dive to climb. Zoom back to altitude. Do it again, and again, and again. The first day, 2 pilots blacked out during the pullout. Their planes recovered on their own, leveling off when the stick pressure relaxed. But if there had been a zero on their tail, they would have died in those 3 seconds of unconsciousness. Chennault taught them the grunt technique. Tense your stomach muscles. Clench your legs. Force the blood to stay in your head. It was ugly, undignified, but it worked. The second day they practiced shooting while diving, real bullets, real targets, oil drums set up in the desert. The difficulty was timing. At 400 miles per hour, you covered 660 feet per second. The target was visible for maybe 3 seconds. You had to anticipate. Lead the target. Fire early. Correct. Fire again. Jim Parker, the young pilot who had watched Bobby Chen die, struggled. He was too cautious, too careful. He would see the target hesitate and pull out without firing. Miss after miss. Sullivan took him aside after the morning flight. You're thinking too much, Sullivan said. I don't want to mess up. You're already messing up. Stop trying to be perfect. Just shoot. That afternoon, Parker dove again. This time he didn't think, just reacted. Saw the target, squeezed the trigger, held it. Tracers walked across the dirt. Impacts on the oil drum. A hit. He pulled out of the dive, grinning like a kid. The third day, December 12th, something happened that changed everything. A pilot named Roy Baker decided he had had enough. Baker was 32 years old, experienced, proud. He had flown in China for 6 months before Chennault arrived. He was part of Bradford's circle, the old guard, the purists. During the morning training session, Baker flew as part of the opposition force, playing the role of a zero. His job was to try to follow the diving P-40S, prove they could be caught. The drill began. Newkirk, leading the attacking flight, rolled into his dive. Baker followed, pushed his nose down, built up speed. But then Baker did something he wasn't supposed to do. Instead of pulling out at the briefed altitude, he tried to turn, tried to cut across Newkirk's escape path at 350 miles per hour in a heavy P-40 at 12,000 feet. The plane didn't want to turn. The air loads were too high. The controls were too stiff. Baker pulled harder, forced it. The nose came around, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Then the wings stalled. Not both wings, just the left wing. Asymmetric stall, the worst kind. The P-40 snapped into a spin, nose down, rotating, falling. Baker fought the controls, opposite rudder, neutral stick. The recovery procedure they had all memorized. But the spin was vicious. The plane was heavy. It didn't want to recover. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. On the ground, Chennault watched through binoculars, his jaw tight. He keyed the radio. Baker neutralized controls, let it recover itself. Baker's voice came back, strained, panicked. I'm trying, it's not working. 7,000 feet, 6,000. Chennault's voice calm, cold. Bail out now. But Baker didn't bail out. He kept fighting, kept trying to save the plane. A pilot's instinct, never give up, never abandon your aircraft. 5,000 feet, 4,000. And then finally the spin broke. The nose dropped below the horizon, the rotation stopped. Baker shoved the stick forward, unloaded the wing, let the plane accelerate, build speed. At 3,000 feet, he had enough airspeed to pull out. The recovery was rough, 7 Gs. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint. But the plane leveled off at 1,500 feet. He was alive. Barely. Chennault's voice on the radio, no emotion. Baker returned to base immediately. The flight landed. Baker taxied to the ramp, shut down, climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking. Chennault was waiting. What did you do wrong? Chennault asked. Baker looked at him, defiant. Nothing. I was trying to prove the maneuver works. You nearly died. But I didn't. Chennault stepped closer. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but every pilot on the ramp could hear him. In a real fight, there would have been a 0 on your tail. While you were in that spin, he would have put 30 rounds into your cockpit. You would be dead, and your death would have been your fault, because you refused to follow orders. Baker's jaw clenched. I don't need lectures from a washed-up has-been. The other pilots sucked in their breath. You didn't talk to Chennault like that. Chennault didn't react, didn't raise his voice, just looked at Baker with those cold, tired eyes. You have a choice, Chennault said. Follow my orders or leave. Decide now. Baker stared at him. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then Baker turned, walked to the barracks. 20 minutes later, he emerged with his duffel bag, got in a truck, left. Nobody stopped him. Newkirk watched the truck disappear down the dirt road. He felt something shift inside him. Chennault wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a game. This was life and death. And the old man was willing to throw out anyone who couldn't see that. That evening, Newkirk found Chennault in his office. Knocked on the open door. Sir, permission to speak. Chennault looked up from his paperwork. What is it, Newkirk? Why do you care so much about the tactics? About us. Chennault set down his pen, leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he didn't answer, just stared at the wall, at a photograph hanging there. 2 young men in World War I uniforms. I told you about my brother, Chennault finally said, David, but I didn't tell you everything. He stood, walked to the photograph, touched the frame. After David died, I requested a transfer to France. Wanted to fight, wanted to kill Germans. They denied it, said I was more valuable as an instructor. So I taught hundreds of pilots, taught them the same tactics that killed David, because that's what the manual said, that's what the doctrine said. He turned back to Newkirk. And you know what happened? 37 of my students died in France. 37, I read every casualty report. Every one of them died in a turning fight, trying to outmaneuver the enemy, doing exactly what I taught them. His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. I carry those deaths with me, every day. 37 kids who trusted me, who believed that if they followed my training, they would survive. And they all died, because the training was wrong. He sat back down, suddenly looked every one of his 48 years. That's why I care, Newkirk, because I won't do it again. I won't teach tactics that kill pilots, not anymore. Even if it means they call me a coward, even if it means I die hated and forgotten. Newkirk stood silent, processing, understanding. I want to learn, he said quietly. Whatever you can teach me, I'll do it. Chennault nodded. Tomorrow, bring Sullivan and Parker. We're going to work on the zoom climb. It's the hardest part. Most pilots pull too hard. Stall out. You need to feel it. Trust the plane. Yes, sir. Newkirk turned to leave. Stopped at the door. Sir, for what it's worth, I don't think you're a coward. Chennault smiled, small, sad. Thanks, son. Now get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be hard. December 15th. The training intensified. Chennault introduced a new element, paired tactics, what would later be called the Thack Weave, though John Thack wouldn't develop it independently for another 6 months. The concept was simple. 2 planes, flying line abreast, 500 yards apart. If an enemy got on one plane's tail, that plane would turn toward his wingman. Not away, toward, drawing the enemy across the wingman's nose. The wingman would then dive on the enemy from the side. It required trust. It required discipline. It required the bait aircraft to not panic, to not break off early. Newkirk and Sullivan practiced it all morning. Newkirk played the bait. Sullivan played the shooter. They ran the drill 20 times, failed 15 of them. Either Newkirk turned too early, or Sullivan dove too late, or they misjudged the geometry. But on the 20th run, everything clicked. Newkirk saw the simulated enemy on his tail. He turned into Sullivan, drew the bogey across. Sullivan dove, guns tracked, perfect firing solution. They landed grinning. Again, Chennault said. They flew it again, and again, and again, until it was muscle memory, until they didn't have to think. That afternoon, Parker asked a question that had been bothering him. Sir, what happens if we die and miss, if we don't kill the target on the first pass? Chennault looked at him. Then you zoom back to altitude and set up for another pass. You have the energy. They don't. As long as you maintain your speed and altitude advantage, you control the fight. But what if they climb to meet us? The Zero climbs well, but not from a low energy state. If they're at 10,000 feet and you're at 20,000 by the time they climb to 20,000, you can be at 25,000. You stay above them. Always. Parker nodded slowly, understanding the geometry, the three-dimensional chess game. It's not about being faster or more agile, Chennault continued. It's about managing energy states. You have more mass, more weight. That's a disadvantage in turning, but it's an advantage in diving and climbing. You use what you have. He looked at all of them, the tired, dirty pilots who had been drilling for days. Modern war isn't about honor. It's not about fair fights. It's about using your advantages and exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. The Zero has advantages, but it also has weaknesses. No armor, light structure, can't dive fast. We exploit that. We force them to fight our fight, not theirs. Sullivan raised his hand. Sir, what about the pilots who won't do this Bradford's group? They still think the old way is better. Chennault's expression hardened. Then they'll die, and I'll write letters to their families, and I'll feel bad for about 5 minutes, but I won't change the tactics to make them feel better about themselves. The bluntness shocked them, but it also clarified things. This was war, real war. People died. The question was whether you died achieving something or died for nothing. That evening, December 18th, Chinese intelligence delivered a report. A large Japanese formation was gathering at airfields in French Indochina. Bombers, fighters, a major strike was coming. Target Kunming, date likely within 48 hours. Chennault read the report, looked at his training roster. 16 pilots were ready, competent in the new tactics. Another 12 were still learning. The rest, Bradford's loyalists, refused to participate. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. He called Newkirk into his office. How do you feel about the tactics? Chennault asked. Confident, sir. I think they'll work. You understand, this isn't practice anymore. This is real. The Japanese are coming, and when they do, people are going to die. Newkirk met his eyes. I understand, sir. Good. You'll lead the first element. 8 planes. Sullivan leads the second element. 8 more. I'm giving you the altitude advantage, 22,000 feet and 24,000 feet respectively. What about Bradford's group? Chennault's jaw tightened. I've ordered them to stay at 18,000 feet, close enough to engage if they want, far enough that they won't interfere with your attacks. If they follow orders, they'll be fine. If they don't, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Get some sleep, Newkirk. Tomorrow we test whether I'm a genius or a fool. Newkirk left, walked back to the barracks, lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow everything would change. Either Chennault's tactics would work and they would win, or they would fail and many of them would die. For the first time in weeks, Newkirk wasn't afraid. He understood now. Understood the physics, understood the plan, understood that survival didn't mean running away. It meant fighting smart. He closed his eyes, slept better than he had in months. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. The last night of peace. Tomorrow the bricks would fall, and the sky over China would never be the same. December 19th, 1941. The day before everything changed. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Japanese formation assembling. 10 bombers, 15 Zero fighters. Launch expected the following afternoon. Target Kunming airfield. Objective, destroy the Flying Tigers once and for all. Chennault stood at the operations map. Red pins marked the enemy airfields in French Indochina. Blue pins marked his own positions. The mathematics were simple. The Japanese had superior numbers, superior aircraft in a turning fight, superior pilot experience in many cases. But Chennault had something they didn't. He had physics, he had trained men, and he had a plan. That morning he sent up a small patrol, 4 P-40s, Newkirk leading. The mission was simple, border reconnaissance. Look for early elements of the Japanese strike force. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary, and if you engage, use the new tactics. It was the final exam before the real test. Newkirk climbed to 22,000 feet. The air was thin up there, cold. His breath fogged inside the oxygen mask. Behind him, Sullivan flew wing. Parker flew number 3. A pilot named Davis flew number 4. They patrolled the border for an hour, saw nothing. Then just as they were about to turn back, Parker's voice crackled over the radio. Lead contacts, 2 o'clock low, 6 aircraft. Newkirk looked. There, 6 Japanese planes, 4 bombers in a loose formation. 2 Zeros, weaving above them as escort. Early elements of tomorrow's strike. Probably a reconnaissance or supply run. The old Newkirk would have dove immediately, attacked, mixed it up. But that Newkirk was gone. The new Newkirk had been trained by a man who watched his brother die for glory. Copy, Newkirk said. His voice was calm. Climbing to 24,000. Hold formation. They climbed. The Japanese below never saw them. The Zeros were scanning the horizon, looking left and right. They never looked up. Why would they? American planes couldn't reach that altitude and still have energy to fight. Everyone knew that. Everyone was wrong. Newkirk waited. Watched the Japanese formation pass beneath him. 5,000 feet below. Perfect geometry. The temptation to dive was overwhelming. His hands tightened on the stick. But Chennault's voice was in his head. Patience. Wait for the perfect moment. He waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The Japanese bombers were past him now, moving away. The window was closing. Now, Newkirk said. He rolled inverted, pulled. The P-40's nose dropped toward the earth. Gravity reached out and grabbed 7,000 pounds of American steel. The dive began. 200 miles per hour, 250, 300. The airspeed indicator climbed faster than the altimeter fell. 350, 400. The engine screamed. The wind howled over the canopy. But the plane was solid. No vibration, no buffet, just clean, brutal speed. Newkirk picked a straggling bomber. Let it grow in his windscreen. Waited. The training had taught him patience. Wait until you can see details. Wait until there's no possibility of missing. He could see the glass nose now. See the tail gunner turning his weapon. Too slow. Way too slow. Newkirk squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted. 70 rounds per second. Each bullet the size of a man's thumb. The recoil shuddered through the airframe but didn't slow the dive. The tracers reached out like a solid bar of light, connected with the bomber's wing root. Metal tore, fuel ignited. The wings separated from the fuselage. The bomber died in 3 seconds. But Newkirk didn't watch. This was the hardest part. Every instinct screamed at him to look, to confirm the kill. and to bank and see the enemy falling. But he kept his eyes forward, kept the throttle against the firewall, kept diving. He pulled out at 8,000 feet. The G-forces hit like a hammer, 6 Gs. His vision grayed at the edges, blood drained from his head, but he kept the back pressure steady. The grunt technique worked. He stayed conscious. The P-40 transitioned from defied to climb. Speed converted to altitude. The zoom, 12,000 feet, 16,000, 20,000. Back where he started. Untouchable. Behind him, Sullivan and Parker had done the same. Different targets. Same result. 2 more bombers damaged. Smoke trails, 1 banking hard for home. The 2 Japanese Zeros reacted. They dove after the Americans, tried to follow, but at 350 miles per hour, the Zeros started to shake. The controls locked up. The pilots fought their planes. The Americans pulled away like speedboats outrunning rowboats. Newkirk looked in his mirror. The Zeros were 5,000 feet below him, climbing slowly, no threat. Element form up. We're going home. They landed at Kunming 30 minutes later. Not a bullet hole in any of them. 2 bombers destroyed. 1 damaged. 0 American losses. The mechanics couldn't believe it. They walked around the planes looking for damage. Found nothing. Just soot on the gun barrels and empty brass casings in the ammo bays. Newkirk climbed out. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization that it worked. The crazy old man's tactics actually worked. Sullivan grabbed him, pulled him into a hug, laughing. "We did it! We actually did it!" Parker was grinning like a maniac. "Did you see that bomber just come apart, just fell out of the sky?" Chennault was waiting on the flight line, arms crossed, no expression. Newkirk walked up to him, extended his hand. "Sir, you were right." Chennault shook his hand, held it for a moment. "Now teach the others," Chennault said. "Tomorrow's going to be much bigger." Before we talk about that battle, and it's a story that still seems impossible, 75 years later, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to change your mind about something you believed your whole life? Maybe it was how you did your job. Maybe it was how you raised your children. Maybe it was something about yourself that you thought was true, but turned out to be wrong. Jack Newkirk had just learned that everything he believed about courage was incomplete. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of pride and trust the math. If you've ever had that moment, that realization that changed everything, let us know in the comments. We'd be honored to hear your story. December 20th, 1941, 10 o'clock in the morning. The air raid sirens began their wailing across Kunming. The Chinese spotter network farmers and soldiers with radios hidden in the hills had picked up the Japanese formation hours ago. The reports came in piece by piece. 10 heavy bombers, 15 Zeros, flying north, ETA 1500 hours. 3 in the afternoon, Chennault assembled his forces. 24 P-40S, every flyable plane, every pilot who could still climb into a cockpit. He divided them into 3 elements. Element 1, Newkirk commanding, 8 aircraft, 22,000 feet, north position. Element 2, Sullivan commanding, 8 aircraft, 24,000 feet, east position. Element 3, Tommy Bradford commanding, 80 aircraft. And here was the problem. Bradford refused to climb to the assigned altitude. Chennault had ordered him to 22,000 feet, but Bradford insisted on 18,000. Close enough to see the enemy clearly, close enough to engage in what he called proper combat. Chennault stood on the flight line. Bradford stood across from him. The crutches were gone now. The leg was healed enough to fly, but the pride hadn't healed at all. "Follow the altitude restriction," Chennault said, "or stand down." "I've been flying fighters for 12 years, Bradford said. "I know how to fight. You know how to die gloriously. I'm trying to teach you how to win. By running away." Chennault's jaw tightened. He was done arguing, done explaining. "Fine, fly at 18,000. But when the shooting starts, if you turn with a 0, you're on your own. I won't risk the other elements to save you." Bradford's eyes narrowed. "We won't need saving." He turned and walked to his plane. 7 other pilots followed him. The old guard, the purists, men who believed that honor in combat meant facing your enemy directly. Newkirk watched them go, felt a sick weight in his stomach. "They're going to die, aren't they?" Sullivan said quietly. Yeah, Newkirk said. Probably. They climbed into their own planes. Strapped in. Ran through the checklists. Started engines. The Allison motors coughed and roared to life. 24 propellers spinning. 24 pilots preparing for the fight of their lives. At 1300 hours, they took off. One by one. Heavy planes clawing for altitude. They climbed away from Kunming. Spread out. Positioned themselves. Waiting. At 22,000 feet, Newkirk circled slowly. The city was invisible beneath a haze layer. The mountains stretched to the horizon in every direction. Beautiful, serene, the calm before the storm. His radio crackled. Chinese ground observers. Many planes coming, big formation. 20 minutes. Newkirk keyed his mic. All elements stand by. Hold your positions. Nobody moves until I give the word. He checked his fuel, his ammo, his oxygen, everything green, everything ready. Then he saw them. 2 o'clock low, still 20 miles away but visible as dark specks against the sky. The Japanese formation. 10 bombers in a tight V, 15 Zeros weaving above them. Confident, unconcerned. They thought the Americans had run away. The airfield below was empty, no fighters climbing to intercept. From the Japanese perspective, it looked like the cowards had finally given up. They had no idea that above them, hidden in the glare of the sun, 24 P-40S were waiting like hawks over mice. Newkirk watched them approach, watched them fly into perfect position. Every second brought them closer to the kill zone. His hands were steady on the controls. His breathing was calm. All the training, all the drills, it came down to this moment. Then Bradford's voice broke the radio silence. Element 3 engaging. Newkirk's blood went cold. Negative hold position. But Bradford wasn't listening anymore. 8 P-40S at 18,000 feet broke formation. Dove toward the Japanese. Not the vertical dive they had been taught. A descending turn. Trying to get behind the Zeros. Classic dogfight positioning. The Zeros saw them immediately. 5 broke off from the bomber escort. Turned to engage. And Bradford's element did exactly what the Japanese expected. They turned harder. Tried to cut inside the Zero's radius. Tried to win the turning fight. It was a slaughter. The P-40S bled speed. The wings lost lift. The planes wallowed in the air like dying whales. The Zeros, light and nimble, cut inside their turns effortlessly. Within 20 seconds, 2 P-40S were on fire. Newkirk watched it happen. Watched 2 planes tumble out of the sky, trailing black smoke. Watched parachutes blossom. 1 chute, 2 chutes. At least the pilots got out. Bradford's voice came over the radio, panicked now, desperate. Brake, everyone, brake, but braking didn't help. You can't escape a Zero in a turn. 3 more P-40S were in trouble. Zeros on their tails, guns flashing. A third P-40 took a burst through the engine. The propeller stopped. The plane nosed down. The pilot bailed out. Bradford himself was being chased by 3 Zeros. He was pulling as hard as he could. The P-40 was shaking, right on the edge of a stall. Newkirk, Bradford's voice, raw, terrified. Help. We need help. Jim Parker's voice came over Newkirk's radio, young, urgent. Lead, we have to do something. Every instinct in Newkirk's body screamed at him to dive, to save them. These were his fellow pilots, Americans, brothers in arms. But Chennault's training held. Chennault's cold logic. You can't save everyone, but you can win the war. Newkirk looked at the bigger picture. The Zeros were distracted. Pulled down to 12,000 feet, the bombers were wide open, undefended, flying straight and level toward Kunming. He made the hardest decision of his life. All elements ignore Bradford's group. Target the bombers. Execute on my mark. Parker's voice, shocked. But sir, they're dying. And if we go down there, we die too. We stick to the mission. Newkirk out. He rolled his P-40 inverted. The world flipped. The sky became the ground. The ground became the sky. He pulled the stick back. The nose fell through the horizon. The dive began. Behind him, 7 more P-40Es followed. Perfect discipline. Perfect formation. They had trained for this. Lived for this. Now they would prove it. The airspeed built. 300, 350, 400, 420. the fastest Newkirk had ever gone. The plane was rock solid, no shake, no vibration, just speed. Pure, brutal, unstoppable speed. The lead bomber grew into his windscreen. He could see every detail, the glass nose, the cockpit, the pilot's face turning to look up, eyes widening in shock. Newkirk waited. Now. The guns erupted, 70 rounds per second. The tracers converged on the bomber's cockpit. The glass shattered. The metal tore. The pilot died instantly. The plane nosed over. The wing tanks exploded. A fireball at 14,000 feet. Newkirk didn't watch, didn't look back, didn't slow down. He dove through the debris cloud. Pieces of aluminum rang off his armored windshield. He kept the throttle pinned, kept diving, past the bomber formation, past the zeros, down to 10,000 feet. Then he pulled. The G-forces were immense, 7 Gs, maybe 8. His vision tunneled to a gray pinpoint. The blood left his head, but the grunt technique worked. He stayed conscious, kept the back pressure, felt the plane scoop out of the T, felt it transition to a climb. The speed bled off, converting to altitude. 12,000, 16,000, 20,000. In 45 seconds, he had dove 12,000 feet and climbed back to 20,000. Physics, beautiful, elegant, unstoppable physics. Behind him, the other 7 planes did the same. 7 targets, 7 attacks. 4 bombers destroyed outright, 2 damaged and trailing smoke, 1 untouched but breaking formation. And the cost, 0. Not a single P-40 hit, not a single bullet hole. The Japanese formation disintegrated. The surviving bombers panicked, jettisoned their bombs over empty fields, turned south, running for home. The Zeros broke off from Bradford's dying element, turned to face this new threat, these diving demons that struck from nowhere. But Newkirk was already back at 22,000 feet, out of reach, setting up for another attack. Now it was Sullivan's turn. Element 2, 8 P-40s at 24,000 feet. They had watched Newkirk's element devastate the bombers. Now they would finish the job. Sullivan rolled in from the east. His element dove on the scattered zero formation. The Japanese pilots focused on trying to climb up to Newkirk's altitude never saw Sullivan coming from the side. The thack weave that Chennault had taught them came into play. 2 P-40s working together, one as bait, one as shooter. A Zero latched onto Sullivan's tail, tried to follow him down. Sullivan led him straight across Parker's nose. Parker dove from above, guns tracked. The Zero fixated on Sullivan never saw Parker until the bullets hit. The Zero's unarmored fuel tank exploded. The plane cartwheeled into the jungle. It happened again and again. The Zeros couldn't adapt, couldn't understand. These Americans weren't dogfighting, weren't playing by the rules. They were hunting. Clinical, efficient, deadly. At the center of the Japanese formation, Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji Ace, with 28 confirmed kills, realized they were losing. Badly. He rallied the surviving Zeros. 5 planes, formed them up. When they dive, we counter-dive below them, he ordered in Japanese. Then pull up and shoot from underneath. It was a clever tactic, used the Zero's superior maneuverability. Newkirk saw the Japanese formation tighten, recognized the trap. Smiled grimly. Element 1 climbed to 25,000. They climbed. The engine struggled in the thin air, but they made it. Now Newkirk was 3,000 feet higher than before. The geometry had changed. He rolled in. 70-degree dive angle, nearly vertical. The speed built to 480 miles per hour. 490, 500. Past the red line. The airframe groaned, the rivets creaked, but American engineering held. Yamamoto saw him coming, executed his plan, rolled and dove below Newkirk's flight path, tried to pull up underneath for the shot, but Newkirk was moving too fast, 500 miles per hour. The Zero's controls locked up at that speed. Yamamoto pulled the stick. Nothing happened. The hydraulics couldn't overcome the airloads. He was a passenger in his own plane. Newkirk blurred past, didn't fire a shot, wasn't aiming for Yamamoto, was aiming to pull him down. The trap within a trap. Yamamoto focused entirely on Newkirk dove to 8,000 feet. Didn't see Sullivan's element high above. Didn't see them rolling in. Didn't see the second wave of P-40s diving on him. Sullivan's guns found him, 30 rounds. The Zero's thin aluminum skin offered no protection. The shells tore through the cockpit, through Yamamoto, through the engine. The fuel tank ruptured. The wings separated. The ace with 28 kills died because he tried to be clever, tried to outthink physics. You can't outthink physics. The remaining Zeros fled, full throttle south, running for home, beaten, broken, terrified. The sky over Kunming went quiet. Just the wind, the sound of P-40 engines cruising, the smell of burnt gunpowder. Newkirk keyed his radio. All elements cease fire. Return to base. They formed up. 16 P-40S, Element 1 and Element 2, not a scratch on any of them. But Bradford's element was a different story. 8 planes had gone up, 4 came back, all damaged. One had a wing that looked like lace. Another had no hydraulics. A third was leaking fuel. The final toll. Japanese 7 Zeros destroyed, 6 bombers destroyed, 2 bombers damaged, American 4 P-40 destroyed, and all from Bradford's element, and all from pilots who refused to follow orders. The 16 P-40S that used Chennault's tactics untouched. Perfect. They landed one by one. The mechanics couldn't believe it. They walked around Newkirk's plane in silence. No damage, not even scratches, just soot on the guns. Newkirk climbed out. His legs were shaking. The adrenaline was fading. He sat on the wing, put his head in his hands. Sullivan landed next, climbed out, walked over, sat next to Newkirk. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Sullivan said, "We left them." "Yeah. They died because we didn't help. They died because they didn't follow orders." Sullivan was quiet. "Then, do you think we did the right thing?" Newkirk looked at him, thought about Bobby Chen burning, thought about the 11 pilots killed in the previous 3 weeks, thought about the 16 planes that came back today without a scratch. "Yeah," Newkirk said, "I do. Bradford's plane landed last, 60 bullet holes. The left wing had a 3-foot tear. How it stayed in the air was a mystery. Bradford climbed out, didn't look at anyone, walked straight to the barracks, sat on his bunk, stared at his hands. An hour later, Newkirk found him there. Bradford looked up. His face was gray, old. "I killed them," Bradford said. "My pride killed 4 men." Newkirk sat down across from him. "They had a choice. They followed you. Because I convinced them I was right. Because I told them Chennault was teaching cowardice." Bradford's hands were shaking, but he wasn't. He was teaching survival, and I was too proud to see it. "What are you going to do?" Bradford looked at him. "I'm requesting a transfer. Transport duty. I'm done flying fighters." He left the next morning. Never flew a fighter again. Spent the rest of the war hauling cargo. Spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that decision. In 1960, he wrote a memoir, called it The Lessons of Pride. It was about December 20th, 1941, about the day he learned that honor without wisdom is just another word for suicide. Which American value do you think won that battle? Was it courage, the willingness to face the enemy, no matter the cost, or was it intelligence, the wisdom to adapt, to learn, to fight smarter instead of harder? Tell us in the comments, because the answer matters. It mattered in 1941. It matters today. And if you served or if your father served, share what you think made the difference in your war. We'd be honored to hear it. The victory at Kunming changed everything. Chennault's report was rushed to Washington, copied to the Navy, copied to the Army Air Forces. The tactics spread like wildfire. Navy pilots flying the F-4F Wildcat, another heavy plane that couldn't turn with a Zero, adopted boom and zoom immediately. At Midway, 6 months later, they used these exact tactics. Destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Army designed new fighters around the concept. The P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons, even heavier than the P-40. Top speed 430 miles per hour. It didn't even try to turn, just dove and climbed. Dominated the skies over Europe. By 1945, Allied fighters owned the air. Not because they were more maneuverable, but because they fought smarter. Jack Newkirk became a squadron leader, a teacher. He trained the next generation in Chennault's tactics, shot down 10.5 confirmed aircraft over the next 3 months, became an ace, a hero. But on March 24th, 1942, Newkirk was leading a ground attack mission over Burma, flying low, strafing Japanese positions. He was hit by ground fire. His P-40 crashed. He didn't survive. 28 years old. The other pilots buried him with honors, named an airfield in India after him, and they kept flying his way. The way that saved lives, the way that won wars. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a P-40 Warhawk, restored, painted with shark teeth, olive drab green. It sits in a place of honor, surrounded by the jets and bombers that came after. Tourists walk past it, read the placard, see the specifications. Weight 7,000 pounds, turn radius poor, top speed 360 miles per hour, slower than the Zero. They shake their heads. How did this thing survive against the legendary Zero? Sometimes, if you're lucky, there's an old man standing nearby. 80s, maybe 90s, wearing a cap that says World War II veteran. A tour guide once asked one of these men, "Sir, did you fly?" The old man nodded. "Flying Tigers. I was there." Kunming. Yes. A kid standing nearby looked up. "But mister, the sign says this plane was bad. How did you win?" The old man smiled, reached out, touched the armor plate on the fuselage. His fingers traced the thick steel. "Son, we didn't win because our plane was better. We won because we stopped trying to be what we weren't. A brick can't dance, but if you drop it from high enough, it'll crush anything beneath it." He looked at the P-40 for a long moment, memories playing behind his eyes. Friends long gone, battles fought and won, a war that changed the world. Then he saluted the plane, turned, walked away. That's the lesson Claire Chennault taught, the lesson Jack Newkirk learned, the lesson that saved American lives from 1941 until today. Know your strengths, know your enemy's weaknesses. Never let pride stand in the way of coming home. Modern fighter pilots still learn these tactics. F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightnings IIs, they don't dogfight in circles. They fight with energy, with altitude, with speed, strike from long range and disappear. Boom and zoom, the same principle, different technology. The DNA of what those men learned over China in December 1941 lives in every fighter pilot flying today. Claire Chennault returned to Louisiana after the war, died in 1958 at age 65. In 1972, 14 years after his death, he was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. The troublemaker, the radical, the man they kicked out for being too smart. He saved more lives than anyone will ever count. Not with courage, with wisdom. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history they didn't teach in school. And tell us, what's a time you had to swallow your pride to win? We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the Flying Tigers. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is fight smart instead of hard. And God bless the men who learned that lesson. The men who came home. The men who won.